First of all, I'm just totally delighted to be here. It's been more than more than a decade that I've been pleading for INSNA to come to Australia, and it's just thrilling to see that we finally made it here, and certainly the first time, but by no means the last time. So I'm also want to join others in congratulating the organizers, having just had the experience of organizing the International Communication Association conference in Paris in a hybrid form, with a lot of help actually from one of our PhD students who's right there, Jasmine Wu. I have a strong sense of appreciation of what it takes to do this. And I am absolutely impressed and stunned at how well things are eventually moving here, even though they might have had a rocky start. So please join me in giving a round of applause to the organizers of this conference. It's been really, really amazing. Okay, so I know that we are starting a little behind what I was supposed to, so I'm hoping I'll get a little extra time on that end there. But I've titled this talk, Understanding and Enabling Networks to Address Grand Societal Challenges, mostly because there are a couple of takeaways that I want to leave you with, hopefully from this, but there's a preamble to that. So before I get into the lecture itself, I do want to acknowledge some of the people who have played an important role in my own career. My advisor, Peter Manji, and Janet Folk, I call them my intellectual academic dad and mom. Everett Rogers and Ron Rice played a very important role. Some of you probably don't know Ev, of course, has passed on. Ron is now at UC Santa Barbara. There was a very interesting window that I'm going to narrate very quickly, and it had to do with, in 1986, I was taking a PhD seminar class with Ev and Ron. They were jointly teaching this at USC at the Annenberg School for Communication. And 1986 was also the year where we had our 6th Sunbelt conference up the road in Santa Barbara. Some of you have seen the video that David Crackhart did yesterday to describe why it's called the Sunbelt Conference. David reminded us that in 1986, that conference was anything but Sunbelt because it rained the entire time. So it was like a drizzle belt or a rain belt conference. It was my first conference, and all of us were told that we had to go. All those who were taking the networks class were given a free ride to, I actually rode in Ev Rogers' Mercedes-Benz car, which to me was woo-woo at the time, from Los Angeles to Santa Barbara. But and we had to go there, and our assignment was that we had to go talk to someone about a paper they were presenting. I tell this story because it's quite an important, pivotal 1-week period that changed the course of my own interest in my own academic career. So I was taking this class with Ev and Ron. I decided that I saw a paper title by a person by the name of Ron Burt, who at the time was at Columbia. I called him on the phone. He was not on email, I was. And I told him, I said, I've been assigned to look at a paper by you and read it before I come to the conference. Could you send it to me? He says, don't worry about the paper I'm presenting at Sunbelt. But I've been writing this paper that I want to submit on the role of cohesion and structural equivalence as explaining contagion, what later on became the AJS classic piece that he wrote. And he said, I'm going to send you a draft of that, and I'd love to chat with you about that at Sunbelt. So I read that very carefully. My undergraduate was in electrical engineering, and I was still fresh with all my formulas. So I was ready to go tooth and nail at a lot of what I thought were his problems that he was doing with his derivations and so on. And then before we got to Sunbelt, Eb and Ron announced that we would have a guest speaker in class who was coming all the way from the East Coast. And that guest speaker was David Crackhart. And so David came and spoke to my graduate seminar about this new idea that he had called QAP. And so within that short period of time, I got to meet David, I got to meet Ron, and then it was a little while later that I ended up spending a lot of time with Stanley Wasserman, especially because he and I overlapped for about 15 years at the University of Illinois. When I went to Illinois as a faculty member, I took his networks class. And at the time, the Wasserman and Faust book was still being written. It was in manuscript form. So it was like all kind of typed sheets. And I got to look at those versions of it, et cetera. And that short period of time, that Sunbelt conference shaped what I thought was what I was going to do for the rest of my life, and that is study networks. And so I think, again, it's important that we're all at these conferences, some of us in person and virtual, but it does make a huge difference when it comes to how these things, especially for the younger folks here, these things can shape your life. As is already mentioned twice, social networks is really, this particular community is incredibly welcoming and nurturing. And I'm proud to be a part of that, being shaped by that, and want to continue to do that in the future. I also have a lot of current and formal collaborators, and I've color-coded their names by the disciplines, because one of the things that I realized is that one of the ways in which I have benefited a great deal is looking at the home discipline, amongst the people in psychology. You have all the way from Leslie DeChurch, who's been one of my closest collaborators for the last several years now, but Suzanne Bell, Dorothy Carter, Raquel, Laura, Pip Patterson, Gary, Patrick Janulis, who is at Northwestern in the medical area, and Dan Newman at the University of Illinois, Katie Faust, Nick Christakis, Bernie, Kathleen Carley, and Carter. These are all people that I have had a chance to work with at different levels, and they all come from more of a sociology background. And then in management, though you can argue Brian is actually a sociology by training, but he's been at Kellogg now for a long time. Brian, Satyam, Roger Leanders, Paul Leonardi, and Fabio. And then I have this guy who I put in there, Johan Koskinen, who I put him in stats. I'm not sure where exactly he belongs. I'm not sure he always knows where he belongs, but that's a different story. And then a lot of people in communication, Eric Eisenberg, Scott Poole, Dimitri, Sophia Fu, Andy Pilney, Michelle Shoemate, and Cynthia Stoll. One anthropologist that I've had a chance to work with, Jeff Johnson, still working with him on a grant. And then computer science and engineering people, Jaideep, Alice, Madhav, Malta, Wei Chen, Zhenghui, and then a bunch of folks in the health area, Wolfgang, Rajiv, Michelle Burkett at Northwestern, and Jeffrey Bingenheimer. Also former PhD advisees of mine who have been especially influential, Edward, Mongshao, Brian, Rob, Lindsay, who is here, I think, Brooke, Alina, Aaron, Marlon, Jackie, Kioske, Diego, and Ryan. And I think all of them have actually been to more than one Sunbelt over the course of things. And I think that's, to me, that's very gratifying. A lot of postdocs who had a chance to work with Hank Green, who's now a faculty member at Indiana, Michael Schultz, who's also actually a faculty member at Indiana, and then Roberto in Italy, Balint, who's now at Facebook, Yun, who is in China, and then my two programmers who really helped a lot with some of the technical developments that you'll see. My current PhD students, I'm going to just go ahead and list them. I see Neelam is here with us, and I'll give her a shout out because she actually helped me with a lot of putting these slides together. And so thank you, Neelam, for helping me with that. But then also not only my own advisees, but other people like Jonathan, who I'm working with, Yashin, Yin Shuang, etc. It has been said in this room by folks who might be actually in the room here that in the short term, we make networks, but in the long term, networks make us. And that's certainly been true for everything that any credit that I'm merit here. So now to the grand societal challenges. I'm going to touch on 5 of these challenges. Disaster response, accelerating innovation, scaling up global health solutions, mission to Mars, and the changing nature of work. So I'm going to try to rush through these as quickly as I can, but I'm going to give you a preamble about what the challenge is in each case before I go and dig into how networks can help us both understand and enable it. So I start with disaster response, even though it's a little old. The research that I did here goes back to Katrina, but I wanted to do that especially because the theme of this conference focuses on those issues, and I think it was important to sort of acknowledge that. So this is the current theme of the conference that we are here, but if you remember, one of the first big disasters that was studied was Hurricane Katrina in August of 2005. It took 7 months later before this report was revealed in the criticism that was a criticism of FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, saying that it really botched up the entire thing. So it took 7 months for them to figure out that FEMA was not doing its job. And the question then, of course, becomes, why did that happen? And is there anything that networks can help? So keep that thought in mind. The second is accelerating innovation. Some of you may have heard of IBM Watson. How many of you, show of hands in this room, have heard of IBM Watson, right? So that's the big one that got a lot of publicity because they were on, it was made by IBM, and they went on Jeopardy, and they were able to beat all but one human as part of the quiz competition that was there on that. You can see from this that his winnings were $1 million as compared to 200K and 300K for the others out there. Now, obviously, this is a technological wonder. It did a lot of great things. And you see out here, it says that it was led by the principal investigator, David Ferrucci. Well, David Ferrucci wrote an article in the New York Times shortly thereafter saying that the technological challenge of of the IBM Watson was nothing compared to the challenge he faced putting the team that built Watson together. And I've had a chance to talk to him on many occasions. He's adjunct faculty now at Northwestern at Kellogg. And he tells a story that when he was asked to do this at IBM, he talked to a lot of people, and everyone that he thought was really smart, turns out, not surprisingly, was so busy that none of them had time to join him. When he finally convinced somebody to do it, they looked at him and said, this is going to kill your career because it's such a crazy idea. So I'm going to counsel you not to do this. Finally, he did convince some people to do it. And the moment he had one person convinced, he went to try to get the next person. And the next person said, who else do you have on board? He says, I have X. And that guy looked up and go, life is too short. You know, X may be smart, but I don't want to be working with X because he's a nightmare to work with. So you see the dynamics of team building becomes quite a serious issue in these contexts. So again, the question then is, how can we think about how networks can help put together the teams that are going to be dream teams like his team in terms of coming up with Watson, et cetera. The third global challenge is scaling up global health solutions. Here, the issue is basically one that says that if you look at different tragedies, one is neonatal mortality, and we'll take a second one in a minute. But if you look at these tragedies, what you find is that there are huge challenges, especially in some parts of the world, especially in the global south, as you can see from these statistics out here, that, you know, the number of people who die shortly after being born, et cetera. The good news is we have solutions for it. Chlorhexidine is an example of one that was developed with a lot of funding from a variety of sources that is inexpensive. There's proof that it can be used. It's very successful. It reduces neonatal mortality dramatically. It's inexpensive. And so the question is, why is it not being used? That was what the Gates Foundation, Melissa in particular, and Bill Gates, Melinda and Bill, Melinda Gates, basically realized that the big challenge was not coming up with these solutions, but scaling them up so that people would actually use them. So this is the issue of convincing people that they needed to do it, because many people wouldn't do it. They would say things like, I can tell you this from India, the state of Bihar, which I'll talk about. I was born in that state. And they go, no, we have a long custom that at the time of birth, instead of putting chlorhexidine on the umbilical cord, which is what was recommended here to reduce neonatal mortality, we have a tradition of putting mustard oil, and no doctor can tell us that we're going to change that tradition because it's sinful for the baby. So you can see there are all kinds of resistance in these particular cases. Just like neonatal mortality, at the other end of the spectrum, we have the fertility rates, the overpopulation. If you look at this graph on the right-hand side, you see that while the global fertility rate is declining, it is not so much in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So if you look at countries like Kenya, Ethiopia, and those places, the situation is very difficult. Again, the good news is we have lots of different modern contraceptive methods. The problem is not that we don't have the technology. The question is, what is the resistance against why we want to be able to use this? Why is it that people are pushing back on it and not taking advantage of these modern contraceptive methods? Again, Melinda Gates and her team approached folks like myself saying, we hear networks are going to help with this. What can we do to do it? And by the way, in this particular case, the additional challenge is we can't collect network data from thousands and thousands of villages, which each have thousands and thousands of people. So as much as you can tell us that networks might help us, is there ways in which you can make that more economical for us to do? So they realized that social networks are important in helping understand the adoption of modern contraceptives, who are the key people, and how can we economically map those social networks. The fourth challenge that I'm going to take you to is one that perhaps is not one you have thought a lot about, because it takes us out of this world, or at least out of this planet. And that's the fact that humans are on the verge of becoming an interplanetary species. There is pretty good evidence that by 2033, et cetera, someone from this planet will have visited Mars and potentially will be back from there. There are a lot of people working on it. There are some challenges associated. The International Space Station is 250 miles above the international, and it's the Mars on the other, so the moon is 250,000, so that's 1,000 times farther than what the International Space Station is, and Mars is 250 million miles, so that's 1,000 times farther than the moon. And so with this comes some other challenges. It's going to take a long time to get there, based upon the orbital, where we are in the orbital route around the sun. It can take us up to about a year to get there, or 260 days to get to Mars. And then we have to stay on Mars for about a year before the orbitals come in place so that we can pop over quickly rather than at opposite ends of the orbit. And then it's going to take us that same amount of time. So it's a 3-year mission, 6 people to 4 people, potentially different nationalities, all cooped together in a small little confined environment with no voluntary exit, the operative work being voluntary. And as you look at this, you begin to see that as you get closer to Mars, that distance, physics comes into play. So you're going to take as much as between 3 to 22 minutes for a message to go from here to Mars, which means that this crew has to operate autonomously. And it's not like when we went to the moon, we said, Houston, we have a problem, and Houston was able to respond to it. This is going to take as much as 44 minutes either way just to get a single response. So as we look at these things, it means we need to have more crew autonomy. And as a result, NASA has said that while for travel to the moon and other places, gravity, radiation are the big risks that we need to take when we go to space. Now, teaming becomes a big risk as we look at it. And as you can see, the bottom here, you see this designation of red that says, as we get into planetary, the risk of teaming is as serious as radiation and the lack of gravity, for example. In fact, a cosmonaut who was on the International Space Station said all the conditions necessary for murder are met if you shut 2 men in a cabin measuring 18 by 20 and leave them together for just 2 months. As a result, Peggy Whitson, who is the chair of the Astronaut Selection Committee, when she's also a veteran astronaut and one who spent more than most other people in space herself, said that they had to change the emphasis of what they were looking at. If you look at the old days, the right stuff, that some of you may have heard of Tom Wolfe and all the kinds of stuff they did. They needed rugged people who were daredevils, who were essentially put into a rocket and shot off like a cannon into space. That's the Mercury mission. But as you began to think of space and teams, etc., Peggy Whitson had this to say.
It was really important. We actually changed the emphasis of the who we were looking. We had thousands of applicants that were technically competent, and we started looking more for those that got the box checked on the report cards and played well with others. Because the long duration missions that had much more emphasis.
So what happens to teamwork when you put people into extended periods of isolation and confinement? By the way, as an aside, based on this research, I got a lot of interest from people to do webinars during the COVID because they felt that this might teach us something about how we were living back on Earth in isolation and confinement back in 2020. But that's a separate story. So as we look at this, we come to the last one, which is the changing nature of work, which is not unrelated to what I just mentioned about COVID. You may have seen this article in the Harvard Business Review titled "The Alternate Workplace: Changing Where and How People Work." And what is interesting is they talked about how this company, AT&T, was putting people to stay at home for an entire period of time, all employees, 35,000 employees. The interesting thing is that this was an article published in Harvard Business Review back in June of 1998. So it was prescient that we were looking at the ways in which we need to rethink about what it meant to be working from home in other contexts like this. You can see it says on September 20th, 1994, 32,000 AT&T employees did. The alternative workplace was something that caught on. It was tried by American Express. It was tried by IBM. A lot of companies were playing with the idea. Then we came to 2022 when we had the worldwide experiment, the involuntary beta test of how we decided to work differently or have conferences differently, as we are seeing here today. And so part of what the challenge here is we are trying to figure out what is the changing nature of work. What was the old normal? What was the new normal during remote work? And how is that changing to the next normal that we are beginning to experiment with even as we speak right now? My key takeaways, whenever I go on international trips, I'm always afraid I might fall asleep in the middle of my own talk. So I'm going to give you the key takeaways right now. 2 slides. One is we're in the midst of a perfect storm to understand and enable networks to address these societal challenges in terms of theories that we've been able to build, in terms of the kinds of methods that we in the field of social network analysis have been spearheading a lot, along with other kinds of computational approaches. We clearly have much more access to data than we've ever had before. And finally, we have the computational infrastructure that we need so badly to make even something as innocuous as ergoms work at a speed that is scalable in terms of really large networks. The second part of the takeaway is from understanding to enabling networks. I'm so gratified to see so many folks at this conference here talk about network interventions. I was lucky to be on a panel of decadal survey for the first time that the National Academy of Science did a decadal survey on social and behavioral sciences, specifically on national security. I will add that I was not the only networks person. You can see Kathleen Carley and Jeff Johnson were also representing networks within this particular panel. And one of the other people on the panel was a guy by the name of Jonathan Marino. I happened to be sitting next to him at dinner at the opening of our session. And without recognizing the name, I started telling him what I did. And I said, oh yeah, you know, social networks. And it goes back to this guy, Jacob Marino. And then he turns around and says, that's my dad. And he gave me this book called The Impromptu Man that he had written about his dad. And you can see the subtitle says, Encounter Culture, Jacob Marino and the Origins of Psychodrama in Counterculture and the Social Network. The reason I bring this up is when I read that book, I was struck in two ways. I thought Jacob Marino was a straight networks person. Who knew that he was an improv man and had all of the psychodrama background and encounter culture background? Networks was just a very small part of his life. The second thing I learned was that he really made it his business that even though he was starting out with networks and his methods were fairly primitive, and his own son says sometimes he was more bombastic in how he made it sound as compared to what he actually had evidence for. But a lot of what he argues for in this space is that he took it very seriously to take networks to solve problems for people, whether it was children, girls in the famous Hudson study, but in a lot of other cases in prison areas, etc. So I think we need to revisit and again remind ourselves that our field started with that interest in helping solve societal problems. And so this is one of the reasons I wanted to bring this up. Of course, in our field more recently, we have people like Tom Valente, who have written about network interventions, people like Laura, who have applied a lot of those in the NIH context, people like Duncan Watts, who wrote this article in Nature Human Behavior, Should Social Science Be More Solution-Oriented? He says social science, but given that he himself is a network scientist, you can see why he's interested in these same set of issues. So if you think about questions we thought we couldn't answer, if you look at disaster response, to go back to the cases, how do multi-organizational networks emerge in response to a disaster? How do we monitor and design interventions to make them more effective? So each time, the second question is more of that enabling. What can we do to take the insights we develop in the first question and use it to address the societal challenges? For accelerating innovations, what are network factors that influence the assembly of innovative teams? The design question is, how do we design a dream team builder to optimize the assembly? When it comes to global health solutions, what are the network factors that determine who influences whom and how in order to scale up the adoption of health solutions amongst providers and public? How do we utilize this knowledge to optimize the speed and scope of scale up at minimal cost? If you look at the next two, Mission to Mars, what are the multi-level factors that influence the emergence of network ties among crews in a long-distance space exploration mission? And then how do we compose those crews that are optimized for long duration space exploration? And how do we design interventions to mitigate crew relations whilst in mission? And then finally, when it comes to the changing nature of work, how do networks change as work evolves from the old normal to the new normal and to the next normal? What distinguishes the network changes among high performers from the rest of us? And then how can we leverage digital traces from our increased use of collaboration technologies to make network insights more actionable in the workplace? Because that's a bonus that we get when we have all this digital trace data. We thought we couldn't answer this because of the challenge of empirically testing, extending, and exploring many of these ideas. But that, I'd say, is only true until now. In the last decade, we've had this interest in an article in the area of computational social science. I was very privileged to be one of the many, many authors that you see listed here for this article that was published in 2009. Many of those, as you'll recognize, are networks people: David Lazar, Sandy Fentlin, Lara Adamich, Sinan Aral, Laszlo Barabashi, Nick Christakis. I can go on. So it's kind of Michael Macy's. There's so many of the networks people who really embrace this area of computational social science. That was in 2009. 10 years later, we rewrote articles. We revisited this in an article both in Nature, talking about how we want to measure algorithmically infused society, as well as a second article in Science that appeared in 2020, talking about computational social science, the obstacles as well as the opportunities that it faces. So let's start with the disaster response one. So now let's go into the research that answers some of these questions, or at least stuff that I've done here. Hurricane Katrina, 2005, you can see the trajectory it takes. Some of you might be now almost at the point where you were not even born when this was happening, but you could see that the red line here shows how it basically came into Florida and then went up the coast, and when it finally ended up hitting, passing through places like New Orleans and so on. So here's what we did at the time. I don't know if Carter is in the room there. There he is. Carter's in the room, so he'll remember this. Right around that time, we both had grants from the National Science Foundation, separate grants, but they were willing to give us some extra funding to try to help understand what happened with Katrina. And so I connected with Carter, and Carter had been scraping and sharing some of the stuff called SITREP, so situation reports. SITREP was basically a little piece of information that every agency involved around the country on helping with Katrina had to put together a statement every day saying what the situation was, where and when, what action was in progress, what was planned, what kind of support they were going to require, and so on and so forth. So this is what that situation report looks like. And Carter, in his infinite wisdom, had been scraping these data every single day for every organization from the web. And then he had a whole bunch of undergrads, students, graduate and undergraduate students who were coding it to see if we could use that to map which organizations were working with one another. At the time, I was at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, and when I was mentioning some of this to colleagues at the Supercomputing Center, this is the place that gave us the browser, the original Mosaic browser, which became Netscape. And they were like, oh, you know, we can do better than have our students work on this stuff. We can use something called text analytics. So this is, we're talking about back in the day, and they had an application called T2K, text to knowledge, and they essentially took the data, the corpus of SITREPs, and did entity extraction of organizations, of names, and of topics. And then what they did was they helped generate networks. This is what the network looked like. So as you can look at it, you'll see the color coding. Red nodes are organizations, green are locations, blue are persons, and a gray is a concept. And as you look at this network, you can begin to see that in the first 2 days after the Katrina, that Florida was the topic of conversation. It's FL in the middle out there in green there. So you see that that's what it looked like. You see Governor Jeb Bush, who was then the governor of Florida. And then you begin to see some of the other organizations. The ARC is the American Red Cross, SAL, Salvation Army. As you begin to see that, the petroleum network, so all of the organizations at the bottom left were all petroleum agencies in New Orleans and Louisiana. They were well connected, ready, mobilized, ready to be able to deal with it. However, what you didn't see was that in this, let me go back to this, in the top left corner here was several of the animal shelter and human shelters. And those were organizations that were not connected to each other, that were very sparse. So right there, visually, you can begin to see that there was something wrong where there were a lot of agencies in the petroleum area that were preparing well for it, where the human and animal shelters were not. Not sophisticated analysis, and that's what I think is interesting about this example. It's very simple to look at the way these dynamics changed from day-to-day period. And then what we did was the simplest of network measures. We just looked at the centrality scores of the various organizations, two in particular, the American Red Cross and FEMA. And you see that the FEMA, which is the green, it's low, meaning it had a high rank amongst the network nodes. So it had a smaller number. And you would expect that FEMA was a very important agency in this respect and would be highly ranked in that network. But as you see over time, FEMA is drifting, and it is actually the American Red Cross that takes over a central position. Remember what I said, that it took 7 months for them to realize that FEMA was botching up the job in Katrina. Here, in almost real time, we were able to look at these graphs, use the simplest of network metrics to be able to see that there was something going wrong. And so this is an example of how even on a very basic level, we are able to use network ways of being able to identify when certain organizations are not doing so well. So next one is accelerating innovation. What are the network factors that influence the assembly of innovative teams, and how do we design the dream team builder to optimize their assembly? So again, remember, this was David Ferrucci telling us that building the team that built Watson was really important. I had the fortune of working with Stanley Wasserman, Katie Faust, and Peter Manji on a series of books, a series of papers and a book on looking at the different motivations for creating network links. This was really at the time when ERGM was coming into place, so it sort of was a dovetail effort to put theory and methods together. And we said that most of the time, where there's any kind of networking, but certainly when it comes to things like team assembly, sometimes you ask someone to be on a team because of self-interest. They have something you want. Sometimes it's social exchange. I want something from you. You want something from me. It could be mutual interest. I don't want anything from you or you from me, but together we have a better shot of getting it from a third party. Those are strategic reasons to create network links. On the right-hand side are what I would call humanistic, naturalistic reasons for creating it. Contagion. Sometimes we imitate other people. If everyone wants to be connected to X, I want to be connected to X. Or balance. I want to be friends of my friends. Or homophily, as we know, birds of a feather, or proximity. All of these are different mechanisms that in the social networks community we know quite well. But as we looked at this, we could begin to see how each of these had a unique, or at least a distinct signature, where certain kinds of signatures in the network would correspond, would signal to us that perhaps people were operating on the basis of self-interest, exchange, balance, collective action, and so on. So the nice thing about what Ergams was doing for us at the time was they were essentially statistical MRIs that allowed us to create macroscopes where we could look for these structural signatures and then begin to understand the extent to which a network was being driven X% by self-interest, Y% by mutual interest, and so on and so forth. It's a bit of a caricature, but it gives the idea there. So how do we design teams? How do self-designing teams assemble? So this is work with my former student, Marlon, who's now a faculty member at USC, and Diego, who was also a former student of mine who started 2 days ago at the Department of Computer Science at Notre Dame, and Jackie, whose photograph is missing from here, but Jackie, who is also a former student of mine, who's starting as an assistant professor, who's a postdoc right now, but starting as an assistant professor at Harvard Business School. So if you look at it, how do people decide who to invite to their team in the modern organizational landscape? Certainly in academics, whenever we want to write a paper or work on a project, we get to decide who do we want to work with, and what are the mechanisms that explain this process. What are the technologies that we can use? So very quickly, we studied this in the context of school teams where people there was a class being taught across 2 universities, across 2 departments, environmental ecology and social psych. And they had to put together project teams. And the goal of the project team was they were required to have members from different universities. And the goal was to simulate an advertising campaign to mitigate environmental sustainability issues. So they had a real challenge, and they had to be interdisciplinary and had to be geographically dispersed. They had to assemble these into teams over the course of 1 week, and they used a technology platform that we developed at Northwestern called My Dream Team. So there were 2 samples. 1 year we had 213 participants into 32 teams in sample 1, and the next year 197 that assembled into 31 teams in sample 2. They used this platform called My Dream Team that we've built. We have links to it. It's now been used by, I think, probably closer to 500 different classes to put teams together. And the basic idea of how it works is it's essentially something similar to Tinder or any of these dating apps that you have, where you put a profile in and then you go ask for people you want with some search criteria, and they'll say, based on your search criteria, I suggest you talk to A, B, or C, and then you can send them an invite, and they can decide whether they want to take the invitation or not. So, but they respond to personal surveys, they state their teammate preferences, they can look at recommendations, and then they could decide if they want to send that recommendation. And it tells them on the search results, I'm recommending Brian because you said you were interested in someone who does presentations, who's good in presentations, finance, and sports. Brian is your person if you want to do that, and then you can go ahead and invite these people. So our interest here was to study who invited whom and why. So that was basically the invitation network was what we were looking at here. So if you look at teammate invitation, we know from research that's been conducted in the past, including some stuff that was done by David Crackhart and Pamela Hines and others, we know that you like to invite people who have similar homophily when it comes to things like gender. We clearly know you want people on your team who are skilled, who are competent. So those are control variables. We have good evidence that you like to work with people that you worked with previously. The devil you know is better than the devil you don't. Our question was, how does recommendation from technologies fit into this? If we give you a list of recommendations, how likely are you to take those recommendations? And so we used Ergams, and the main hypotheses were well supported in both samples. If a person's name showed up in the top 10 recommendation, you were more likely to invite them. And if they did prior collaboration with you, you were more likely to invite them. What was interesting was the interaction between the two. That is, to what extent were you more likely to invite someone if you had previously collaborated with them and their name showed up on the recommendation list. And what we see is quite interesting, that you don't get as much of a lift. If you look at this graph here, if you have previously collaborated with someone, you're definitely more likely to invite them. That's the likelihood of teammate invitation goal is the red line. The blue line is if you had no prior collaboration with them. But notice that the blue line jumps up more if someone's name shows up in the top 10 than the red line jumps up, which basically means that the recommendation you get from a technology to create a new, what I would call a new network intervention, who you're going to create a network tie with, is more consequential when that recommendation is about someone you don't know, you've not previously collaborated with, than someone you have previously collaborated. And so these are the kinds of insights that we want to develop in both these. This worked out in both samples, and this was published officially this year in Social Networks, this particular set of results, the teammate invitation networks. But is it enough to just understand what happens? How do we then enable team assembly? So we want to build what Americans will understand in baseball is Moneyball to help assemble the next Watson team. So this is trying to use sports analytics and people analytics to put together the best teams that you can. In the interest of time, I'm just going to tell you that we have two really good platforms, one that I've already described to you called My Dream Team Builder, and the second one called the Dream Team Recommender, where we literally have the entire Northwestern database of every scholar at Northwestern. It's called NU Scholars. And you can go put in there and say, I'm interested in working on a project with somebody who is an expert on smoking issues, somebody who's interested in social networks, or somebody who's interested in breast cancer. And then you can say, I want people who worked previously together. I want some junior scholars. I want someone with a high H index. I want people from different departments. I want to work with people who are friends of mine, who have worked with collaborators of mine, but not my previous collaborators. And it'll essentially spit out all the possible teams, and you can decide if you want to invite them to do it. We're in the process right now with an NIH grant where it is being used at Northwestern to help study how these teams can come together, whether they use the platform and to what extent that might change the dynamics of it. So the next one then, moving to global health solutions very quickly. What are the network factors that determine who influences whom and how in order to scale up the adoption of health solutions? I'm going to touch on two very quick ones. One is the scale up of the neonatal mortality issue. So this was a project funded through the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation. And collaborators here again were Michelle Shoemate at Northwestern, Paul Leonardi, who was at Northwestern at the time, now Santa Barbara, Larry Prusak, and a bunch of folks from the Gates Foundation itself. And the state of Bihar which is one of the world's worst neonatal mortality cases. It also happens to be the state where I was born. So I had a personal affection to go back and see what I could do to help in that area. And the idea was that they wanted to see how we could have any touch points that could convince the health providers to use chlorhexidine, for example, or tools like that. This was not targeted at the general public. This was targeted at health providers to get them to do the right thing in the hospital. And so what we did was we did a network analysis of 16,000 government employees in the healthcare area. This was not done through any electronics because there was no electricity, leave alone Wi-Fi to do those kinds of studies. So this is done pen and paper, where we were able to collect these kinds of data from all the health workers in the entire state. And we asked them questions about their network ties, their current and preferred media preferences, their likelihood to adopt a variety of practices. Chlorhexidine was only one, others were in nutrition and so on. And what were their disposition to different social influence strategies? Now, this is a map of the state of Bihar. They gave us the dark gray, which said that these were states that had so far already adopted it, and the light gray states were the ones that had not adopted it. So the goal was, how do we take people from use the network to get people from one state that had adopted it to move to other states that had not adopted it. I did an initial dashboard. We did a pilot study, and I presented a dashboard of a network of who is connected to whom. I presented this at the Gates office in what they call the India country office in New Delhi. And they looked at me and said, wow, this is great, because most time when people give us a network, it looks like ooh and ah is an eye candy, but we can't do much with it. And you've given us not a dashboard, but a do board, which I felt rather flattered. And that flattery lasted for exactly 2 minutes, because as soon as they looked at it, they said, so you're telling me that A should contact B so that A's district will get more likely to adopt this as compared to B's district. And I said, that's exactly right. And they go, but what exactly should B be telling A, or what should A be telling B? And I was just frozen. I'm like, wait. And I literally said this. I said, I've given you a dating system to tell you who you can go on a date with. And now you're asking me what I should be doing on that date. And they said, yeah, well, what else do we want to do? And that's not enough. And I like, okay. And I had to go back and realize that in our field of social network analysis, when we talk about the word social influence, we almost always refer to it just in terms of the network structures. There's a whole field in psychology that, and communication, ironically, that talks about social influence in terms of the strategies we use. And what I ended up having to do was realize that something that was missing in the literature was combining the social influence literature from networks with the social influence literature in terms of strategies. How do you persuade people to do it? And different people have different rights. Broadly, some people have a need to be right. Factual information will get them to change their opinions. But as we know from climate change and American politics, everyone is entitled to their beliefs irrespective of whether they're right or wrong. Those are the people who apparently change, not because they have a need to be right, but a need to be liked. And so there's a lot of literature in this area. And in this article, Leslie the Church, who's a psychologist, and I published this in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science as a way of integrating these two different aspects of social influence. And on the left-hand side, what you see are the different network approaches. On the right-hand side, what you see are the social motives that we have, whether you need social proof. It says 8 out of 10 people use this particular Tide, some washing detergent, or 9 out of 10 doctors use this particular toothpaste. And those are different ways in which we can use the strategy. So again, we built an approach there with the network that not only helped them understand what was happening, but gave them a dashboard that not only told them who to connect with, but said, if you want to convince the person in this village, this person is more likely to be amenable to fact-based approaches as opposed to affect-based approaches, which means you give them some gift or you get some other way in which you can convince them to do it. The next one is in the area of family planning in Kenya. And this was work that we looked at in the overpopulation situation that I was describing to you. And here the goal was to get people to use modern contraceptive methods. Again, here we have a whole bunch of folks who are still continuing to work with this data set. Neelam, who's here, and others from Northwestern. Wolfgang Munar, who was my project officer for Gates in the first project, now became my collaborator as a faculty member at George Washington. We had some other folks here, and most recently, we are actually analyzing these data with Johan and Jonathan as well. So we have, the team continues to expand on this one. So the basic idea is something quite similar. We're trying to understand use of family planning methods. We understand from the literature on theory of planned behavior, theory of reasoned action, that there are attitudes that affect behavioral intention, that affect the use of family planning methods, same thing with social norms. Our addition is what comes on the left. And that is most of these theories of planned behavior and reasoned action assume that we can get people's attitudes and social norms, but they don't look at the network origins of that attitudes and social norms. And so in an article that based on the first Gates project that we published in Journal of Communication, we talk about how we can use networks to get at those attitudes and social norms. In this case, we collected data from 2 villages in Kenya, Moyo and Ganga A. One had a very low prevalence of modern contraceptive use. The other one had a pretty high prevalence, and we wanted to see whether the network factors differed. We went and did interviews and focus groups in these villages, house-to-house surveys. These are photographs that I took of the team that when we were there conducting some of these studies. We used, in this case, a fantastic piece of software called the Trellis software. That was built by Nicholas Christakis and his team at Yale, which had received a parallel grant from the Gates Foundation to the one we had received to do the one in Kenya. So we were able to leverage these resources in this area. And it was amazing because, as you can see, it was conducted by a person who had an Android phone, and it didn't need to have always connectivity. And we took photographs of people to go along with their names and standing in front of their household so that they could identify one another. Many of them were illiterate. And we would then be able to get a whole bunch of information about them. And we could also track their locations, which, by the way, gives all kinds of interesting data about the ways in which we respond to surveys and the ways in which surveyors themselves conduct these interviews. And we published that also in Social Networks last year in the special issue on data collection that came out. So that talks about the ability to collect that kind of data. What did we find? Communication on modern contraceptive use was very different in the 2 villages. Here again, we went to all the adults in the 2 villages, 665 in Moyo and 1,000 over 1,300. You can see, obviously there are some differences in the ways in which this network works. And here again, we use now autologistic actor attribute models as a way of trying to understand what influenced an individual's ability to do this. The results that I'm presenting you here actually came from MPNet, the stuff that Peng has been working on. But right now we have new results that were presented earlier today, actually, that are looking at Bayesian alarm approaches, also getting at the same thing. This is work that we're doing with Johan and John and Neelam, amongst others. So what we do, so we have the data from both the villages as well as each of them by themselves. And I'm just going to translate what it is. We found, for example, things like a person is 0.69 times less likely to use modern contraceptive if they believe that God determines the number of children. That was true in both the villages, and it was specifically true also in Merzimuryo. In the modern contraceptive, a person is 0.6 times less likely to use it if they believe that it can cause health problem, 1.71 times more likely to use it if she believed that people around her value the use of modern contraceptives, and a person is 19 times more likely to use it if they believe that they know how to use it. So that's the self-efficacy part of that. Obviously, we were interested in the networks part of it. And again, here we found that a person is 0.68 times less likely to use if they report talking about modern contraceptive with someone else who believes that God is the one who determines how many children. So this is where you are looking at other people's opinions about it. And then, of course, you can also look at contagion effect. We found that a person is 1.28 times more likely to use it if they report talking to someone who also actually uses modern contraceptives. So what was really interesting about this is, as much as this is helpful, the agency, the foundation said, this is great, but you clearly have shown that there were differences in the two villages. So you don't have any generalizable knowledge. So how do we go and do this without giving $1 million, which is what this grant was overall, to do this in every single village and map the entire social networks? So that's where the paper that we are talking about comes into case, where what we're trying to do is, to what extent, now that we have in these two villages the full network, how can we identify efficient ways and principled ways of being able to do sampling of egocentric networks from these villages in order to be able to generalize to what we would have gotten from the whole village? It's almost the same as what we do in survey results, right? In survey data, normal survey data, we're not doing population surveys, we're doing sample surveys and making really good claims on the basis of that. So this is an effort that I'm really excited about, that Neelam presented earlier today based on the work we've done. And then the mission to Mars, and I'm going to try to rush through this here, and then the changing nature of work. So the multi-level factors associated with mission to Mars. Again, this is work that is done by several folks that I've already mentioned, and Suzanne Bell, who I have not specifically mentioned, who is now at NASA, but at the time was at DePaul University in Chicago. So what happens to teamwork under extended periods of isolation? The bottom line is it's a team staffing dilemma. How do we find out that if we know other countries are sending people with certain gender, personality, what should be the American profile that will best sit with all of these people? So wouldn't it be nice to have a human petri dish where we could manipulate people's isolation and sensory depression for thousands or hundreds of days, and while making them do complex and boring tasks, and monitor them 24/7 physiologically and via audio, video, and administer unlimited surveys? Well, that would be Zimbardo's dream and our nightmare, and no IRB, at least in the Western world, would approve of this. But wait, that is exactly what we're doing, because NASA has these facilities called HERA, the Human Exploration Research Analog, where they put people into these sessions. This one on the top right there. All of these photographs are taken from an HERA facility at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. And we get to study these people for 45 days, where they are done exactly what I just said. You put them in confined spaces, you observe them, you ask them to do network surveys every day, you ask them to do all kinds of activities, and you see what happens to them. And just because you might be feeling guilty about Americans doing this, we're not the only ones. The Chinese have a facility, which they euphemistically refer to as the Lunar Palace. The Russians have a facility called NEK. In fact, the Russians and the Americans collaborate very closely on this. We are right now, this week, debriefing with a set of 5 crew members who were in that facility there called NEK in Moscow. And that included 2 Americans, 2 Russians, and an Emirati, United Arab Emirati. And they have been in there for 240 days. And we did this entire study with them. And this past week, we've been interviewing all of the people who are now coming out of that 240-day mission. And it's fascinating to see the kinds of stories you hear about people in those situations. Japan has its own facility. And then, of course, there are others, the European Space Agency and private foundations. Our interest was networks. We collected data that looked like this. This was an actual data. And the top is an arrow, green set of arrows that says, who do you get along with? Who do you work with effectively? And the bottom line is a hindrance die, which says, who makes tasks difficult to complete? Now, you don't have to look very closely at this to notice that as you look at the hindrance dies, there's one poor person at the bottom who very quickly is seen as a hindrance by everyone. And this person has no idea that the others see them as a hindrance. They don't see others as a hindrance, and they seem to get along well to work with those people. Our challenge is, could we have predicted who this person was and be able to either identify and not send them on the mission, or if we identified them, could we do something to mitigate against that? So we built an integrated model of all the things that could affect social relationships between crew members. Some of them are personality, some of them were what we call shared dyadic attributes, personality fits, some of them were social network trends like reciprocity, transitivity, some of them were external factors like the workload and task. And then finally, the context would be things like calm delay, because they were simulating a mission out on the space. So they would actually, on day 20, suddenly have 2-minute delay of communication between their mission control, which is actually literally right outside the Hera facility, and them. They were put into sleep deprivation for 48 hours at a time. They had cumulative workload stress. And so just also the fact that you were there for a certain amount of time would stress them out, et cetera. So we built this model theoretically, and then we collected data from everyone in the crew during the entire mission. And we did this many times over. And we used that to then build a computational model where instead of parameterizing the model by ourselves, we essentially had the data estimate what the parameters were. So it's kind of like a regression, but not really. It's using a set of genetic algorithms that allows us to do that. And once we build a model, we can see how good the model is and we can experiment with it. So this is what it looked like. So we used a platform called a NetLogo. Oops, sorry. Supposed to start working. Yeah, there you go. There it is. So this is NetLogo. And so this was actually fitting actual data to this to see how well it was doing, and was using that to estimate the parameters. And here's what that data looks like. The task, affect, and who do you enjoy working with, and hindrance. Lots of things. As an example, it turns out that our favorite network personality variable of self-monitoring turns out to be very helpful in space. Those crew members who tend to enjoy working with individuals, they tend to enjoy working with individuals who are high in self-monitoring, and they are less viewed as making tasks difficult. So a positive value on task affect, a negative value on hindrance. Cumulative workload, no surprise, as workload goes up of the sender, the person who's reporting it, they say that they don't enjoy working with other people, and that's the negative relationship that you see out there. So how well did these model work? We took the data, we took the model, and then we began to see how well it did on the training data. So on the data on which it was trained, and we see that based on things like accuracy, precision, recall, and F1 scores, we're actually doing surprisingly well. I would say scarily well, if you ask me, in terms of being able to predict this. Again, when it comes to on a test data set, it'll obviously be not as good as the training data set, but it's still pretty good at giving us an F1 score, which I think is the most important one. It's the harmonic mean of precision and recall, which for those who are not familiar with machine learning parlance, is like it's essentially like type 1, type 2 errors. So think of it in that fashion. And a test F1 score of 0.808 is actually pretty good. We don't do so well when it comes to hindrance. Here hindrance F1 score is 0.566 in the training and 0.373 in the test. Part of this is the good news for the crew that they didn't have many hindrance dies, but the bad news for us, because you can't build a good model of this kind if you don't have enough of the ties to be able to do that. So again, we did this data, we started the conceptual model, we did the empirical observation, we did the estimation, we've done the validation, now it was time for the application. This came about because as we were looking at this, when we presented this to NASA, they said, this is fantastic, you predicted who's not going to get along with whom on a certain day, but that's not enough. What are we going to do about it? And so again, this was great to be able to get the folks from there tell us how we might want to be able to help. So all of a sudden, we were now in the business of taking our pairings that we do of tasks and using it to repair their relationships. So I was very proud of coming up with the repairing for repairing ties in this particular case. And so what we did was we did, again, went back into the same facility because we've been having access to this every 3-month sessions, 4 times a year for the last 6 years now. And so we went back and we got the team. They said, here is who's going to be in the crew. We ran simulations before they went in, a week before they went in, and said, so-and-so is not going to get along with so-and-so on day 20. And here is what we think you should do. We should reassign them different tasks to work with different people so that we can see if that makes a difference. And of course, because it's a controlled experiment, we had to look at them different kinds of pairings, in some cases where we expected them to do well, in some cases where we didn't expect them to do well, so that we were able to see the factual and the counterfactual. The goal was to maximize the number of days where they worked well together and minimize the number of days when they would find each other difficult to work. One of those pairings was for a task called phobos. And essentially what they were supposed to do was work together to get soil samples from an asteroid. And what you see out here is that when it came to asking people whether they enjoyed working with a partner on the phobos task, the green, which we predicted would do better, showed up to be better in 3 out of the 4 cases. And it was, I mean, these sample sizes are pretty small. So, we have to do a lot of non-parametric tests, but it was still at the 0.08 level. Again, when we asked the question, does this person add friction to your relationship with your partner? In all 4 cases, the one that we thought would be the worst pairing was in fact the worst pairing. So again, we were beginning to see it. Again, in the interest of time, I'm not going to do this, but we have a dashboard that we have built for them called Tool for Evaluating and Mitigating Space Team Risks, Team Star. My specialty is coming up with acronyms, thank you. And so this is the ways in which we actually built a tool where they are now funded us just this past year to make this tool available to the astronaut selection committee for the Artemis missions that are going to put the first woman and the first colored person on the moon in the next 2 to 3 years. So again, last one very quickly, yet the changing nature of work. How do networks change as work evolves from the old normal to the new normal? And how can we leverage network data? In an article that Paul Leonardi wrote in Harvard Business Review titled Better People Analytics, we had an interest for a period of time in how we could help take a lot of what we've learned in networks and make it actionable in the workplace. So we made the case, we called it that people analytics is mostly attribute work, but in fact, a lot of what we should be doing is relational analytics, which is a fancy way of saying network analysis. And we used arguments such as this, that, just like the brain allows us to go in and see an abnormal one from a normal one in MRI context, we can do the same thing, but instead of using a microscope in social networks, we use a macroscope. As we zoom out, we are going to be more likely to see certain kinds of patterns. So we talked about these different kinds of structural signatures in the article. Nothing new here. Anyone interested in social network analysis, what's an ideation signature? Somebody who's in a position that connects people who are not connected to each other. Influence signature, eigenvector, efficiency signature, density of network ties within a team. External network ties outside the team is what we call the innovation signature, modularity, which is a silo signature, and then vulnerability, which is a brokering from the outside. Our point is, none of this is new. The question is, why is network stuff not being used? David Krakauer wrote an article that I still use in HBR a long time ago, and I'm sorry to say, but none of us have been very successful in getting the world to tilt over and be knocking on our doors to run network analyses in these organizations. Well, one reason is that surveys are take a lot of time. They elicit low response rates and are rapidly obsolete. So what if we could do it at minimal cost with 100% response rate and get updated every 24/7? Well, one way that we can begin to see that is if we were to be able to look at all the digital traces we leave by our use of tools like Slack and Jira and Zoom and so on and so forth. So it's an open question. Will we be able to take these kinds of data and see if they substitute for what happens in surveys? So you take all this digital trace data that we're generating, the question is how quickly can we then, how effectively could we predict what someone would say on a survey by simply looking at their digital activity? We began to do that in 2019. And again, this was a team that I did in collaboration with folks at Fudan University in Shanghai. And we collected data from several organizations. One in particular that I'm going to talk about, 66 employees at a Chinese company that uses enterprise social media, not unlike Slack. You can see from the looks of this, it looks very similar. And we took the digital trace data, and then we did a survey, and we wanted to see how well we could predict what they would say in a survey based on what they did in terms of digital trace data. And so we asked them survey questions like, this person provides me a sense of purpose. Who do you rely on for leadership? Who do you go for help or advice? And we use ergoms as a way of trying to see how well we could predict it. And as we began to model these, we learned some things quite interesting. This person, if the question was, if this person provides me a sense of purpose, employees who send one message per day are 15.2% times more likely to say that person provides them with a sense of purpose. People who send someone 10% more messages than they receive from that person are 26.7 times more likely to say that person provides them with a sense of purpose. Again, there are ergom tables that go behind this. I'm not going to go into details of that, but in the bottom line is we were able to do pretty well when it comes to predicting what people would say in a survey by simply looking at their digital trace data. If you look at these results, again, here you see the precision and recall, and you see the area under the curve as a way of seeing that. I wouldn't put too much emphasis on the 89.46%. That looks really good, but that could be high if there are very few cases of people who don't say something. So that's misleading. But if you look at the other numbers, you begin to see that there is a lot of promise in how we can take digital trace data as a substitute or a surrogate for survey data. And we put this into a relational analytics dashboard, again, another place where we can go into an organization, take the data, digital trace data, predict what people would say on a survey, and then use it to compute all the signatures I talked about, the ideation, influence, and so on. So we actually have a case study that we now use in many of my professional development classes where people are doing exactly that. But then 2020 happened, and we realized that we were standing on a landmine of good data because we had already collected these data before. And so we then decided to see how we could use this to see how teaming was happening during the time of COVID. And Jasmine, who's here, is one of the people who has been involved in that also, along with our collaborators, and thanks to 2 NSF grants that we've received on this. So we collected data from 5 companies in the US and China along the same lines that we did in the Chinese case. And what we did ask here, and I'm going to rush through this in the interest of time, one company that we collected data from in China had 3 departments, 185 employees, 34 offices, 16 cities, 18 teams across the cities. The nice thing about China was they gave us a compressed version of the old normal, the new normal, and the next normal. In the span of 6 months, they went back to work, what they call phased return. And so in that period of time, we looked at the data before the COVID hit. Then when they became aware of it, which was around the 11th of January, when they left their office, which was the 4th of February, and they stayed home longer because it was also the Chinese New Year, and then they began to come back a few days later. So this gave us a very sort of microcosm view of the entire shift in these 4 cases. And so what we did was we had digital trace data also on their use of a tool, not unlike Zoom, for the entire period. So we were able to map networks that looked at exactly who was having meetings with whom over that entire period of time. We only looked at meetings that involved 7. So a meeting like this today would not count that you and I are together, because we know that the rule of 7 means you interact more closely when you're in smaller groups than in larger sessions like this. These are what the networks look like on a sample day during each of these periods. We averaged across those periods 66 days before, 9 days during the looming, 9 days shift to remote, 20 days later, and we wanted to compare it. And I thought it'd be interesting to give, again, a simple EI index, because it's one of the favorite network concepts that thanks again to David, that people in all areas who are not network statisticians get. So we computed the EI index, and sure enough, we found pre-crisis, there was an external focus. During the crisis, people looked inwards. They were much more focused internally than externally. And when they came back out again, they were now again a little more external, but they were balanced as compared to what they were initially. So again, you don't need very complex analysis sometimes to get some really interesting insights. During the time of a crisis, people are going to turn inwards and focus internally. However, what happens to why that may have been the norm for most people, but in this article that we published, that Jasmine took the lead on, that was published in a JAP last year, what we found was that if you look at the ways in which people create links, maintain links, dissolve links, and reactivate links, which is what you're seeing on this graph out here. So you can look at within the team links. The yellow link is when they create a new tie. A blue link is when they maintain it. The dotted link is when they dissolve a tie. And then the green link is when they reactivate a tie that they had previously and had subsequently dissolved. You find something very interesting as you look at these data. What you basically find is that during the pandemic, higher performers were more likely to be the boundary spanners by creating more inter-team ties and dropping intra-team links compared with lower performers, because we had independent data on performers, individual performance, which you could use. So even while the norm was to circle the wagons and have more internal links, the high performers were actually bucking that trend. They were the ones who were actually going out more and having these kinds of links, sorry. And again, the higher performers were also more likely to reactivate both the intra-team and inter-team compared with lower performers. And so again, if you want to hear more about not just what I just described, but also how tide dissolution is a function of how different kinds, the ways in which we relate to the use of technologies. A plug for Jasmine's session tomorrow morning, where she talks about how does hybrid work affect how perceptions of technology advice affect it. So the key takeaways, again, I'm here to wrap up, was what I started out with. I'm glad that I'm still awake to recap those for you, the four, the theory, methods, data, and computational infrastructure. You recall that over the course of this presentation, I've touched on various dashboards that we've used, that we've created in each of these areas, my dream team to self-assemble teams. The nice thing is we're giving our folks an opportunity to use technology and giving ourselves the opportunity to collect data from their use of the technology. The Dream Team Recommender, the same thing in terms of what we mentioned, Northwestern. Influence Strategy Wizard, which was the dashboard we used in India. In the case of the Kenya study, the payoff was the methodology so that we could economically map, we hope, large-scale social networks by just looking at egocentric samples rather than actually mapping the entire network. And then Team Star and the Relational Analytics Dashboard. One postscript. We really benefited from how we have said today's lecture has been mostly about how social networks have impacted grand societal challenges. But grand societal challenges have also been the tail that have wagged the dog of social network methods. And the best example recently is relational event modeling, which I remember a time when there were no papers in relational event modeling. And as digital trace data became more and more prevalent, people realized that the presence of this data invited the opportunity for developing relational event models. So now we have this dilemma where we have some independent areas of work being done on events, and then we have this independent work being done on the dynamics of states. And if you look at it, some of those are actor events, some of them are relational events, some of them are actor states, and some of them are relational states. And so we have this 2x2 that we have created, and we have methodologies that are filling parts of the puzzle, but we don't really have something that is able to look beyond that. And so what I want to leave us with is what I call SNA's next holy grail in terms of methodology. We have stochastic actor-oriented models, which started out by just taking relational states and seeing how they might predict future relational states. Sturgeon's did very many of the same things. Then we had also extensions to those that looked at coevolution between active states and relational states. And so that's what you see on the right-hand side of it. Then you also had things, and then there were also ways in which actor events could be put into stochastic actor monitor. I haven't seen many of them, but you can imagine a situation where actors, if they have certain kinds of events that could affect what their actor states may be in relational states are. We have RLAMs that allow us to take what is happening with actor states as the dependent variable, with actor events and relational states as predicting what happens to your state. That is the kind of dependent variable we've talked about. We have relational event models that are now taking relational events and looping them on each other, and advances to it where we are taking actor states and also seeing how it may predict relational events, as well as relational states that might predict relational events. But these are new developments. So essentially what we are seeing is this merger of some things that have been like stochastic actor-oriented models that have focused more on states, and then relational event models that are focused more on events. And we need to see how, and we've already seen, in fact, Christoph's at Freeman Award lecture, somebody specifically asked the question of how we might want to combine this. And I swear the slide was done before that. But I do think that it reassures us that this is in fact something that is on the horizon that we need to be doing. And frankly, I just want to end with this network, what I call network science fiction, at least for now. That is the ability to be able to build statistical models that allow us to see the coevolution of actor events, relational events, actor states, and relational states. It's a challenge again for us as we try to do this going into the future. So again, I want to thank you all for giving me this opportunity to talk with you. And I want to give special thanks again to Neelam for helping me put all of these slides together here, and of course, all the funding agencies who make it possible for all these collaborations to work. Thank you so much.
Wow. what a talk. That's fantastic, Nosh. Thank you so much. Do we have questions from the audience?
Yes, I'd like to echo that. Wow, that is quite extraordinary, not what you've been able to do. I have a sort of semi-serious, well, I think it's a serious question. You describe a number of instances in which, in working with a partner organisation who wants to achieve some outcome, you've kind of done some work, then you've had a conversation, and they've come back with a new question, and you've done some more work. Do you think that's changing the way in which you're thinking about framing initially what you do?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that and what that looks like.
I think that's crucial, because when it comes to things like enabling, we have to, I joke sometimes that it keeps my research honest, because I need to know from them what it is. And I think a lot of times when people have done network analysis, me included, we go in and try to negotiate and wrangle a network data set and come back, and then we basically work with it. And there's a lot of value in two ways. When we go back with the results to them, we can see, and they can have their eyes open and say, oh, wow, I hadn't thought about this. Sometimes they're going to come back and tell you, yeah, but this is missing the point, or this is incomplete. And I learn from that. I think that is telling us something really important about why we have to get out of that mindset that we know what it is that they want. And they actually know a lot of what they want and are willing to tell us if we listen to them about it. And I think that helps us in the long term, because then they buy in more into the idea of networks. In each of these instances and others that I haven't talked about, it really, it's a win-win for them to learn more about it, and for us as a community to get more credibility. Because I've been in situations myself, I will plead guilty, but also I've heard from others where people said, I don't want to do a network analysis. Somebody came and did one 3 years ago, and I never saw their face after they collected the data. And that we're just not serving our interests well, especially as we start negotiating much more sensitive data of the digital trace data that I'm talking about, where the level of trust has to be really, really high in order to be able to, and they have to see value before they're going to share any more data. And my team will tell you, including those here, that they've witnessed me have tough conversations with some of these companies that we're working with, where we talk to them, we say, we're going to give you value, but we're going to stand for what we want, and we're not going to, and you can decide if you don't want to do it. But we're not going to be able to give you good insight if you don't give us the kind of data and access to data that we're requesting. But that comes with building trust and building credibility. Great question. I certainly hope we could do more of that.
It's also wow from me. It was amazing. I have a question. I found really inspiring the way that you just don't try to understand things, but it seems that you try to build things, you try to change things. And also the talk was, I think part of the wow was that it was in the best possible meaning of the term. It was all over the place, that you don't do just one thing, and you don't use just one tool, and you don't have just one approach or one sort of philosophical underpinning that sometimes people find in social sciences. It's because this is my methodological tradition, or this is my philosophical point, so this is how I do things. And I wonder where this comes from, sort of not being afraid or ashamed to take whatever tool works for whatever problem you find the most important. Whether is that I don't know, your engineering background, or is that, where is this coming from?
Well, I think I think it's curiosity. Thank you for saying those things. I do recognize myself in what you're saying. There are some people who think of me as very narrow in the field of communication. They look at me like I'm a one-trick pony, where I see networks everywhere. And so it depends on where you are, you might see more nuance in what I'm doing than if you are coming from a different area, where everything this person looks at is, he sees the world as a network, he sees every problem as a network, he sees every solution as a network. So that happens. That said, I think that for me personally, the big opportunity that I have benefited from is having collaborators from a lot of different disciplines, because that gives me an opportunity to learn enough about what each of them is doing, and to be able to share with them enough about what we do in networks so that they get excited about it. Because almost everyone I worked with, when I first met them, they had heard of networks. They were interested in it, but they would not, and then within a few months or a year, they would be rolling, terms like ergams and alarms would be rolling off their tongue. And I thought that that was for the betterment of everyone. And I was learning from them. I mean, I learned a lot about things like precision recall and machine learning techniques, et cetera, text analytics techniques from them without being an expert on it. Sometimes we call that the T model, where you have deep expertise in one area, but you have a certain amount of expertise in a lot of different areas. And to me, that's been a lot of fun. So to me, I've just enjoyed this so much that I can't think of anything better.
Nosh, I think you've touched on it a little bit already, and this has been a question that's come up, but for early career researchers in networks, what advice might you give?
Early career researchers, I've been very fortunate in having had a lot of amazing students that I've learned from, but I also took that a lot from my own mentors. And that's why I started out by saying that. And I think that some of the things that first of all, I'd say, for those who are early career researchers, don't get hung up on your dissertation. I remember one of the best pieces of advice that Ev Rogers gave me was, he said, if you look at any researcher in networks and you see what they're doing 10 years after they've done their dissertation, chances are pretty good they're working in some completely different area. So those who think, oh my God, I have to do this dissertation because it's so important and it's going to be the be all and end all of my career, don't worry about that. The dissertation is primarily to prove that you can do something and you can do it well. You prove it to yourself and to a bunch of your committee members and peers that you'll learn how the conduct of research. But then, you do other things in that area. I think having fun with what you do is really, really important. And I think that I cannot understate the value of doing that. I also think it's really important for early career researchers to make sure that they have a signature of what they are interested in, so that when you have collaborations with people today, increasingly, we live in a collaborative world where most of our students and most of our work is done not in individuals, in teams. There's lots of evidence for that. But I think as an early career researcher, you have to be very careful in choosing the collaborations you're doing with others, so that your intellectual identity is clearly seen in what happens, so that when it comes up with things like recognitions, the Freeman Award or tenure or promotion in any of these areas, people will look at X and say, X has worked with a whole bunch of other people, but there is a common theme that goes across all, and that's the essential X intellectual identity. So to me, it's more important to make sure you stay honest to what your core branding is intellectually. Even if it means that sometimes that you don't have some of the collaborations or some of the funding that someone wants to bring to you. Oh, question there? I know I'm between you and the Salt. Is it called the Salt Lounge? Is that?
Thank you so much for the talk. It was wonderful. And as an early career researcher, I really appreciate your advice. But I'd also like to hear what advice you give to the older generation and how they can support early career researchers in developing their career.
I'm happy to do that, because I'm trying to live that right now, and I hope I mean, it remains to be seen how successful I am with that. But what I would say is, notice that I gave a lot of photographs today, and not one to senior faculty anywhere. The names were tucked away, because they're not the ones who need the publicity. They're not the ones who need the visibility. So whenever you saw any photographs, I was very, very strategic in making sure that I gave all the shout outs to the younger generation, because they are the individuals, you're the ones who are doing a lot of the work, frankly. I don't think it's a secret for me or for most other people. There may be a few exceptions. At this point, I'm not doing a lot of the analysis myself. I'm not sitting in front of the computer running it. I'm sitting with students who are running it and coaching them and making sure that they're doing the right thing, etc. So to me, I think it's important to mentor them, but it's really important to give them the opportunity to get the credit, to stand in front of the crowd, and to be able to receive the kudos that they deserve. Because that's going to help them build their careers. And at the end of the day, I think this is true for many. I certainly know that it's true for me, that I don't think that anything is going to be more important for me than my ability to say that I had trained as many students or inspired as many students. Because that to me at this stage of my career is much more important than anything else I could do. That's the big multiplier effect, as I would call it. And so I think that that's, to me, I've seen a lot of my mentors do that well, and I certainly aspire to that.
I think on that note, which is a wonderful note, please join me in thanking Nosh for an absolutely wonderful and inspiring keynote address. Thank you, Nosh.
Thank you, Dean. Thank you all very much.
Just for
Thanks. Oh, there's more. Oh, my goodness. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, that concludes the Simmel Award for this evening, and thank you, Noshir. Really, that was just fabulous.